The weekend had started off with the kind of peace my wife and I had been craving for months, a rare stretch of time away from the buzzing phones, crowded offices, and endless responsibilities that seemed to pile higher every week back in the city. And as the late summer sun cast golden streaks across the still water of our small lake, I remember thinking to myself how lucky we were to have this cabin, this refuge that had been in my wife's family for generations, a place built with cedar logs and memories of fishing trips, family cookouts, and starry nights. Yet that tranquility shattered abruptly, like glass struck by a hammer, when Karen from the Homeowners Association appeared at the end of our dock. Arms crossed, lips pursed into a permanent scowl, her entire posture radiating indignation as though our very existence had offended her sense of order. And I should have known then that the day was about to spiral out of control. 'Cause Karen wasn't the sort to let anything go without a fight, not a garden planted without permission, not a deck chair that didn't match the community aesthetic, not even the sound of children laughing too loudly. She was the type of woman who thrived on rules and reveled in their enforcement, no matter how minor, and she always seemed to be looking for some imagined violation to elevate herself above her neighbors. So when she started screaming about our cabin being in violation of several unspecified codes, her shrill voice echoing over the lake like an air raid siren, I could already feel the day's peace unraveling thread by thread. I tried to answer calmly, asking her what exactly she believed we had done wrong, but she only grew louder, her words tumbling over each other. Something about unauthorized renovations and unreported gatherings, though it was clear, from the wild glint in her eyes, that she didn't actually have any evidence, just suspicion fueled by the fact that she'd noticed a new coat of paint on the shutters and perhaps heard us laughing with friends by the fire pit the previous night. So instead of engaging in rational discussion, she declared in triumph that she was calling the police, her fingers stabbing at her phone screen with exaggerated fury as though she were dispatching troops to handle a national emergency. My wife, standing beside me on the porch with a coffee mug still in hand, merely raised an eyebrow, her calm demeanor a sharp contrast to Karen's theatrics. But I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, not because we had done anything wrong. We hadn't, but because I knew how far Karen would go to manufacture drama. And the idea of uniformed officers arriving to inspect our beloved cabin because of her petty power trip filled me with a mixture of anger and dread. Sure enough, within 15 minutes the distant wail of a siren broke the stillness of the lake, sending birds scattering from the trees, and soon a patrol car pulled up along the gravel road that wound to our property, its red and blue lights strobing across the water in sharp flashes, and Karen, practically vibrating with self-righteous energy, ran toward the vehicle, waving her arms like she had just summoned salvation, her shrieks carrying phrases like "they're hiding something, they've broken HOA law, and you need to search everything." As if we were fugitives instead of homeowners trying to enjoy a quiet Saturday. I stood frozen for a moment, caught between disbelief and simmering irritation, watching this absurd scene play out as the officers stepped out of their car with professional composure, their faces neutral but clearly weary of the spectacle already beginning to unfold, and Karen wasted no time inserting herself into their space, pointing at our cabin with wild gestures, her words pouring out so fast they almost lost meaning. But the officers, trained to sift through hysteria, remained measured, one of them taking notes, while the other kept scanning the property with a careful eye. And I realized that this was the moment Karen had been waiting for, her chance to drag us through a public ordeal, to flex her supposed authority, and to bask in the glow of law enforcement validating her constant surveillance of her neighbors. But inside I knew the truth: there was nothing for them to find. No violations, no illegal structures, no shady business, only a family cabin, freshly painted shutters, and two people trying to breathe for once without someone dictating how we should exist. So as Karen continued her performance, pointing at our porch furniture, the way the canoe was tied up at the dock, even the firewood stacked neatly against the cabin wall, I couldn't help but marvel at how far her obsession had driven her. To weaponize the police over trivialities, to disturb the peace of the entire neighborhood, just to scratch the itch of her need for control. And though I didn't yet know how the officers would respond, I felt the tension mounting. The kind of slow-burn anxiety that makes every heartbeat louder in your ears, 'cause this wasn't just about Karen anymore, this was about principle. About whether we would be bullied into compliance with arbitrary whims, or whether reason and fairness would finally expose the absurdity of her crusade. And as the officers began walking toward us, their boots crunching on the gravel path, Karen trailing behind them with a smirk of smug satisfaction spreading across her face, I braced myself for whatever was about to happen next, determined not to let her ruin the only sanctuary we had left. The two officers walked with steady, deliberate strides, the crunch of gravel under their boots. Almost too loud in the silence that had fallen over the scene now that Karen had momentarily run out of things to shout, and though my heart pounded with the anticipation of some humiliating inspection. In front of this woman who had made it her mission to torment her neighbors, I kept my expression calm, partly because my wife had that same unshakable calm beside me, sipping her coffee as if the entire debacle were nothing more than an inconvenient interruption of her morning, and partly because I knew that showing nerves would only feed Karen's smug sense of victory. The taller officer, his hand resting casually on the radio clipped to his vest, looked from Karen to me and then to my wife. And as his eyes landed on her, something shifted so suddenly in his face that even I noticed it instantly. The tight neutrality of duty softened into recognition. His posture straightened, and without a word he snapped to attention and raised his hand in a sharp, respectful salute, the other officer following his lead in perfect synchrony. And for a moment the world seemed to freeze, even the lake itself, holding its breath because Karen, who had been vibrating with triumph only seconds before, now stood rooted to the spot, her jaw slack, her fingers still midpoint in the air as though she'd been turned to stone. I looked at my wife, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod in acknowledgement, returning their salute with the simple grace of someone who has long since grown used to recognition, but never seeks it out. And it was in that moment Karen's power evaporated like mist in the morning sun, her screams and accusations suddenly weightless against the quiet gravity of respect the officer showed my wife. "Ma'am," the taller officer said, lowering his hand, his voice carrying warmth and reverence, "we didn't realize this was your property." My wife, with her usual humility, replied softly, "It's our family cabin, officer. Nothing more, though I could tell from the way." His gaze lingered that he knew very well it was much more than that, because my wife wasn't just any civilian homeowner, she was a decorated veteran. A woman who had led teams in dangerous operations overseas, someone whose name carried weight, in law enforcement and military circles alike. And though she never boasted about her service, those who knew her reputation carried it with them like a story passed between brothers in arms. Karen, meanwhile, was struggling to find her voice, stammering about violations and HOA codes that suddenly seemed ridiculous even to her own ears. Because in the presence of uniformed men saluting a woman she had just tried to humiliate, her authority crumbled into dust, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked small, unsure, her eyes darting between the officers and my wife, as though trying to recalculate her entire worldview. The officers, however, gave Karen no more than a polite but dismissive glance, the taller one addressing me now with a professional smile. "Sir, we received a call about supposed code violations, but from what I can see, this is just a well-kept family cabin. Nothing illegal, nothing suspicious, nothing requiring police involvement." And the other officer added pointedly, "We're sorry for the disturbance." It seems like a misunderstanding, though the sideways look he gave Karen suggested he knew exactly what sort of misunderstanding it really was. I felt a rush of relief wash through me, mingled with a surge of pride in my wife, whose mere presence in history had diffused a situation that Karen had been certain would end in our embarrassment. And now, with her plan backfiring spectacularly, she was left standing awkwardly on the gravel road, her arms flapping uselessly as she tried to salvage some shred of authority, muttering about rules being rules and everyone having to follow them. But her voice had lost its edge, her tone thin and uncertain. While the officers were already turning their attention back to us with genuine courtesy, asking if there was anything they could do to make up for the trouble. "No, thank you," my wife answered with that same composed grace. "We're just here to enjoy the lake and a bit of peace." And with that, the matter was effectively closed. Though the symbolism of the moment lingered in the air like a bell's echo, Curran, the self-appointed enforcer of order, rendered powerless in the face of true respect and authority. Her shrieks swallowed by the weight of reality, while my wife, who never needed to raise her voice, stood as steady as the cabin itself, radiating the kind of quiet strength that silences storms. The officers offered their farewells with another subtle nod of respect, returning to their patrol car without even glancing back at Karen, who stood frozen, her cheeks red with embarrassment, her mouth working silently as though trying to stitch together an excuse. But the only sound that filled the space after the cruiser pulled away was the gentle lapping of the lake against the dock, as if the water itself was mocking her silence. Finally, after several long seconds, Karen muttered something inaudible and shuffled off toward the main road, her shoulders hunched in defeat. As I watched her retreat, I couldn't help but marvel at how quickly arrogance could collapse. When confronted with the reality of someone else's earned respect, the woman who once strutted through the neighborhood like a queen had just been reduced to a humbled, wordless shadow of herself. And though part of me wanted to gloat, to throw some cutting remark after her, I didn't need to, because the silence spoke louder than anything I could have said.
Ow.
My wife simply set her coffee mug down on the porch. Rael looked out at the shimmering water, and with the faintest smile said, "Now, where were we?" As though the entire ordeal had been nothing more than a passing storm cloud, incapable of blotting out the enduring calm of the lake. And in that moment I realized that Karen could call 100 cops, file 1,000 complaints, but nothing. She did whatever take away the dignity and quiet strength that my wife carried with her. The kind of power that doesn't need to scream or demand compliance, it simply commands respect, even from those who arrive expecting otherwise. And as the day stretched on, the lake returned to its peaceful rhythm, the sunlight glittering on its surface like a mirror of everything that had just transpired, a reminder that sometimes justice doesn't come in loud proclamations or heated arguments, but in the simple, deniable truth of who someone is. And that truth had left Karen frozen, defeated, and silent in a way no rulebook ever could.